If it wasn't horrific enough that he murdered his entire family, he then lived with their corpses in the family home for weeks. It was December 2019 in Celebration in Florida. So-called Disney dad Anthony Tote was a physical therapist who ran a practice in Connecticut. He was married to Megan, who was 42, and she was just the most amazing mum. She really held down the fort when he was often away with work, and she really had her hands full because she had 3 kids and a dog. The children were Alexander, 13, Tyler, 11, and Zoe, just 4 years old. Now you can actually see Breezy, the family dog, just like cut off in the corner here. Bless him. He's even like looking towards the camera for this family photo. Oh my god, he looks so adorable. And Megan was an extremely intelligent woman, and she was actually homeschooling all of the children, so she definitely had her hands full. And to the outside world, Anthony looked like a great dad. He was nicknamed Disney Dad because the family lived very close to Disney World and they would holiday there regularly. Anthony also worked with disabled children and worked as a youth football coach, so on paper he really did seem like this perfect all-American dad. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, and what he was about to do is just so evil I can't even comprehend. Now that year, 2019, police got wind of some suspicious activity happening at Anthony's physical therapy practice. It seemed like he was kind of maybe overcharging his clients or just charging them for appointments that didn't even exist, that had never even taken place. So there was an investigation opened into him. It transpired that he was spiraling into a lot of debt. He was spending a lot of money on these like Disney holidays that I talked about, but he had about $100,000 in unpaid loans. But Megan was totally unaware of this. She was, like I said, just holding down the fort at home. She was just in charge of looking after the kids, and that was honestly like more than a full-time job. It was around Thanksgiving that Anthony claimed to his colleagues that he had to go back home to his family in Florida for some reason, and he would reschedule all the appointments and he'd be back in touch. But he never was back in touch. The practice just eerily sat there closed with not even a facility to leave an answer message, and the family were also very hard to get hold of, hard to speak to on the phone. Extended family and friends only heard via very limited texts from Megan's phone, in which she was seemingly texting them to say they were unwell and couldn't talk on the phone. Days and days and then weeks dragged on with no news until police were alerted by Anthony's sister and they were asked to do a welfare check. Now, to be honest, police did go and do a welfare check of sorts on the 29th of December, but it kind of feels a little bit half-hearted. They just turned up, they knocked on the door, they didn't answer, so they just kind of shrugged and left. But the problem wasn't resolved. The family was still nowhere to be seen, and post was piling up at the front door. Now, the landlord had even sent an eviction notice because the pair were so behind on bills, but still nothing. So the police were again asked, will you please go and do a welfare check? So they went round on the 13th of January at this point, and police at this point had got an arrest warrant because of the potential fraud that was going on with Anthony at his healthcare practice. So luckily when they arrived, Anthony was actually there at the property. But what lay inside the home was like something from their worst nightmares. The smell was overpowering, and inside one of the bedrooms lay the bodies of the Tote family, wrapped in blankets, decomposing. The family dog was heartbreakingly also killed. It was clear this family had been dead for weeks, just lying there in this bedroom. And Anthony started making up stories about what had happened. He just kept sort of chopping and changing his story constantly. He initially told officers that he'd taken some medication to unalive himself. This was immediately when they turned up to arrest him. He said that he'd taken some medication and he needed like medical assistance, so they got him medical assistance. And he firstly confessed to the killings, and then he retracted this and said that he didn't remember anything about what had happened, and he didn't even remember to confessing. He sickeningly then tried to pin these murders on Megan. He said that it was Megan who had killed the kids and then killed herself. Bear in mind, the crime scene really indicated this was not the case. Megan's wounds were clearly not self-inflicted. He said that she'd done this and he was just sort of trying to figure out what to do, but then changed his story again and said, yes, it was him who had killed the family, and he was trying to actively unalive himself as well, so that him and the whole family could pass through to the afterlife because the end was coming. To be honest, he was literally just trying to weasel his way out of this in any which way that he could. The autopsy showed that everybody had been stabbed to death and the children had been given Benadryl prior to this. And interestingly, this wasn't the first horrifying crime case in Anthony's family. In fact, in July 1980, his dad was arrested for something horrific. He was charged with hiring one of his former students to kill his wife so that he could marry the woman he was having an affair with. Anthony was just 4 years old at this point and actually witnessed the attack on his mum. She was shot in the head, but thankfully survived. She did actually ultimately eventually go on to remarry somebody else, which is good news. So back to Anthony, he seemingly turned into the inflatable Michelin man that stands outside the tyre garages and was sentenced to life in prison. He did also get an extra year as well for killing the family dog. We still can't be sure of the actual motive for the killings because Anthony is obviously incapable of telling anybody the truth. Neighbours felt that the house was creepy, but what lay inside was worse than their worst nightmares. This was a real-life house of horrors. It was the 7th of December 1981 in Westfield, New Jersey. Neighbours of the List family felt something was odd about the family home. Church music was playing constantly and the lights were all on at all hours of the day and night. Eventually they decided to call police and ask them to do a welfare check. It just seemed odd that there was literally a family of 6 living there and they hadn't seen a single soul. When officers turned up, they couldn't believe the horror they walked into. 5 members of the List family lay inside deceased. So what on earth had led up to this brutal massacre? Family consisted of John List, the dad, and Helen, the mum. They got married and had their first child in 1955, and their kids were Patty, John Jr., and Frederick. But the family were far from a normal, happy family unit. Helen was deeply unhappy and had turned to alcohol and medication to try and make her feel better. The family were initially pretty religious, but Helen soon got sick of the religious lifestyle and decided to stop going to church. Now, John was not happy about this, but he was very keen to keep up appearances and wanted the family to look to the outside world super successful. So he decided to buy a large mansion, but he could not afford this without his mum's help. So she gave him some financial help to buy the mansion, but she didn't do this out of the goodness of her heart. She wanted to live with the family, and he couldn't exactly say no when she'd funded half of the house. So the family lived there together for a while: John, Helen, the kids, and the mum. But neighbours noticed that John was just very odd. He was very rude to people who decided to make small talk with him. He would also mow the garden lawn in a full suit, even on a hot summer's day. Some even called him sinister and had seen him apparently screaming at his children. Then, like I said before, in December 1981, things started to feel weird. Neighbours just couldn't understand why the family had seemingly vanished. When police entered the property, there was a horrific smell. They ultimately came across a scene that one officer described as something he could never forget. The mum, along with the 3 children, lay shot to death with their heads covered on the floor. But these weren't the only victims. John's mother was found also deceased in the attic of the home, but John himself was nowhere to be found. Police were really confused about maybe whether John was also a victim and his body was somewhere, or whether he was the perpetrator and had fled. That's when a letter was discovered in the home, which basically just helped them figure out what on earth had happened here. John had written a letter exactly a month prior, documenting how he had killed all of his family members and writing down basically like wishes for their funerals. Then just days later, his car was found at JFK Airport, and pretty much everybody was fearing that he'd just fled to either a different country or a different state. The FBI got involved but had absolutely no luck in tracking him. Then in 1989, America's Most Wanted aired an episode about John. An expert created this model of what John would likely look like at the time in question, and it caught one woman's eye. She phoned in and said John List looked remarkably like her neighbour Bob Clark. It turned out John had taken upon a new identity and was living in Denver, Colorado with a new wife. She seemingly had no idea that she was married to a mass murderer. Now, police arrested him and matched his fingerprints to the prints at the crime scene, and it was confirmed this was John List. It turns out before the murders he'd been sacked from his job but kept it secret from his family. He still would dress like he was going to work and left the house each day and just went and sat on a train for the whole day, basically. He started stealing money off his mum, and he said he didn't want to tarnish the family name, so he planned the deaths for a month and felt that killing them was like rescuing them. Horrifically, he admitted that he systematically killed the family members one by one. First his wife, then his mum, as she'd apparently heard a noise and come inside. He then waited for his kids to return home that day before killing them one by one. Now, the final child, John Jr., actually had a football game that evening, so he was back home a little bit later. So John decided to drive to the football game, watch him play, see him enjoying himself, and then kill him when they got back home. And chillingly, he describes sitting in the house, peacefully eating his tea before heading to bed inside of the home that he'd just murdered all of his family members inside. And bizarrely, he said he didn't unalive himself because he didn't want to go to hell, and that would mean he would go to hell. Not murdering 5 people. He started a new life in this new area, like I said, and he told his new wife that his previous wife had died from cancer. John was ultimately convicted of the murders and given life in prison without parole. He died in 2008 and honestly showed no remorse.